A man stands in the cold gray light before dawn, knee-deep in the Sea of Galilee, dragging a net that has caught nothing all night. His hands are cracked. His back aches. He smells of salt and fish and failure. He does not know that this is the last ordinary morning of his entire life. Because a voice is about to call across the water. And when he answers it, he will trade his boat for a road that ends, more than 30 years later, on a Roman cross, hanging upside down by his own request, in a city he never wanted to see. His name is Peter. And he is only the first. For 2,000 years, people have argued about how many followers Jesus really had. Crowds of thousands on a hillside. 70 others sent out 2 by 2. But at the center of all of it stood 12 men. Ordinary men. Fishermen, a tax collector, a political radical, a few you have never heard a single story about. And here is the part nobody tells you. Almost every one of them died for what they claim to have seen. Not for a philosophy. Not for a warm feeling. For something they swore they witnessed with their own eyes, in broad daylight, with their own trembling hands. This is not a story about 12 names on a Sunday school chart. This is not a story about stained glass and golden halos. This is not a story about saints who were born holy and never struggled. This is a story about 12 frightened, flawed, completely human men, and what happened to each one of them when they decided an empty tomb was worth dying for. So let me take you to each of them. One by one. I want you to meet them the way the people of the first century met them, not as statues, but as men who sweated and argued and were afraid. And I promise you this. By the end, one of these men is going to be standing alone on a black volcanic rock in the middle of the sea, the last one left alive, every friend he ever had already in the grave, and what he sees on that rock will close the entire Bible. We will get to him. But not yet. Stay with me. Let's begin where Jesus began. By the water. Peter was born Simon, a fisherman from Bethsaida, loud and impulsive and gloriously imperfect. When Jesus met him, he looked at this rough, unstable man and said something almost absurd. He said, "You will be called Cephas." In Greek, Petros. It means rock. And it was almost a joke, because Peter was the least rock-like man you could imagine. He sank the moment he tried to walk on water. He swung a sword at exactly the wrong moment and cut off a servant's ear. And on the worst night of his life, he stood by a charcoal fire in a courtyard and swore, 3 separate times, that he had never even known the man he loved most in the world. But here is what most people miss. The story does not end at that fire. After the resurrection, this same Peter stood up in the middle of Jerusalem, in front of the very crowd that had screamed for the death of his teacher, and he preached without flinching. 3,000 people believed him in a single afternoon. The man who once lied to a teenage servant girl now would not stop talking, no matter how many times they arrested him, beat him, or ordered him to be silent. The early church historian Eusebius, writing his careful records in the 4th century, points to the same end that Roman memory preserved. In the city of Rome, under the Emperor Nero, in the wave of persecution after the Great Fire, Peter was condemned to die on a cross. And the tradition tells us he said he was not worthy to die in the same position as his Lord. So they turned the cross over, and they crucified him upside down. The rock held. Right to the end, the rock held. Next to Peter, almost always, was his brother. Andrew. Andrew is the quiet one. Where Peter shouts, Andrew taps you on the shoulder. He was actually the first of the 2 to follow Jesus, and the very first thing he did with his new faith was go and find his brother and drag him along too. That was Andrew's entire life in one single motion. Bringing people. He is the one who found the small boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish and brought him to Jesus before 5,000 were fed on the grass. He is the one who brought curious Greek visitors to meet Jesus in the final week before the cross. And when it was all over, Andrew carried that same quiet habit to the very edge of the known world, preaching in the wildlands around the Black Sea, in places where Rome itself felt far away. The tradition says he was finally sentenced to death on a cross shaped like the letter X. And here is the detail that stays with you long after you hear it. They say he was not nailed but tied to that cross, so that death would come slowly, over days, in the heat and the cold. And for 2 full days, hanging there, unable to move, Andrew kept preaching to the very crowd that had gathered to watch him die. He died exactly the way he had lived. Still bringing people in. Now watch what happens next, because the stakes are about to climb. There were 2 men named James among the 12, and the first one, James the son of Zebedee, carries a terrible distinction. He was the first of the 12 to die. And for this one, you do not have to rely on tradition at all. The Bible itself records it, plainly, in the book of Acts. King Herod, wanting to please the crowd, had James put to death with a sword. That is nearly the whole verse. He killed James the brother of John with the sword. But sit with that for just a moment. This was not a minor figure. This was one of the inner 3, one of only a handful who climbed the mountain and saw Jesus transfigured into blinding light, one of the 3 who were closest to him in the garden on his last night. And the historian Eusebius preserves a haunting tradition passed down from the earliest believers. The Roman officer who guarded James and led him to his execution was so shaken by the man's courage and peace that the officer confessed faith on the spot, and the 2 of them were beheaded together, side by side, accuser and accused walking into eternity as brothers. The first of the 12 to fall. And he took one of his own executioners with him. And this brings us, naturally, to his brother, John. But hold that thought about John. Because his is the story I promised you at the very beginning, the man on the rock in the sea, and we are not there yet. There is too much road to walk first. Let me pause here for just one moment. If these men are starting to feel real to you, if you are beginning to feel the actual weight of what they paid, do me one small favor and subscribe to this channel. Bringing these forgotten lives back, in full color, is the entire reason this place exists, and your being here is genuinely what keeps it alive. Now let's keep walking, because we are not even halfway through the 12. The 5th disciple is Philip, also from the fishing town of Bethsaida. Philip is the practical one, the one who reaches for a calculator. When Jesus turned to him and asked how on earth they could feed the enormous crowd, Philip immediately ran the numbers and announced that it was impossible, that half a year's wages would not buy enough bread for everyone to get a single bite. He was the kind of man who wanted evidence before he committed. "Show us the Father," he said once, almost frustrated, "and that will be enough for us." And yet this careful, evidence-demanding man carried the message all the way into what is now Turkey, to an ancient city called Hierapolis. The tradition there is strong and old. Philip was seized and put to death for his preaching, and they say that even as he hung dying, he prayed for the very crowd that had condemned him. The man who once asked to be shown proof spent the end of his life becoming the proof. The 6th disciple is one that almost nobody can name. Bartholomew, also called Nathanael. His story begins, of all things, with sarcasm. When he first heard about a teacher named Jesus from the town of Nazareth, Nathanael actually scoffed out loud. "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Those are his first recorded words in all of Scripture. He was a skeptic. A man with low expectations and a sharp tongue. But when Jesus saw him coming, he said, "Here is a true Israelite, in whom there is nothing false." He told Nathanael that he had seen him under a fig tree before they ever met. And something in the skeptic simply broke open and gave way. The traditions say Bartholomew carried the gospel a staggering distance, all the way to Armenia, far beyond the edges of the Roman world. And the way they say he died is almost too brutal to speak aloud. He was flayed alive, his skin stripped from his body while he still breathed, and then beheaded. The man who began with a sneer ended as one of the most savagely martyred men in all of church memory. And he did not crack. He did not recant. He held. Here is the part nobody tells you about the next man. Thomas. We have done him a deep injustice. For 2,000 years we have branded him with one word, doubting, and we have shrunk an entire courageous human being down to his single worst moment. Yes, when the other 10 told him that they had seen the risen Jesus with their own eyes, Thomas folded his arms and said he would not believe it unless he touched the wounds himself. "Unless I put my finger where the nails were," he said, "and my hand into his side, I will never believe." But do you remember what actually happened next? Jesus appeared in the locked room a week later, turned directly to Thomas, and offered him the wounds. "Here," he said. "Touch them. And the strange thing is, Thomas did not need to. He fell to the ground and spoke the highest words that any human being speaks to Jesus anywhere in the four Gospels. "My Lord and my God." And then this so-called doubter did something absolutely staggering. He traveled farther than any of the others. Past Persia. All the way to India. And this is not just legend you have to take on faith. There is an ancient community of Christians in India to this very day, going back many centuries, who call themselves the Thomas Christians and trace their faith directly back to this man. The tradition says he was killed there, on a hill, run through with a spear. The man who once wanted to touch a wound was, in the end, pierced by one of his own. Do not call him Doubting Thomas again. Call him the one who went the farthest. The eighth disciple is Matthew, and his story might be the most scandalous of all, because of exactly what he was before Jesus found him. Matthew was a tax collector. And to feel what that meant, you have to feel the hatred behind the word. A Jewish tax collector worked for Rome, before an empire crushing his own people, and he took money from his neighbors, often skimming extra off the top to keep for himself. He was a traitor with a ledger and a guarded booth. He was the man everyone spat at on their way to the market. And one ordinary day, Jesus walked straight up to that hated booth, looked the traitor in the eye, and said two words. "Follow me." And Matthew stood up, left the money sitting on the table, and never went back. There is a Greek word for what he became. Apostolos. It means, simply, one who is sent. The traitor became a sent one. And the man whose only skill was writing things down, recording numbers and debts, picked up his pen again for something entirely new. Many believe Matthew wrote the first gospel, the very book that opens the whole New Testament. He took the one ability the empire had trained into him, careful record-keeping, and he turned it to recording the words and works of the Son of God. There is one more thing about the records, and it concerns a name we cannot avoid. Judas. Judas Iscariot was the ninth man, and he held the money bag. He was the treasurer. He sat at the same tables as all the others, saw the same blind eyes opened, heard the same impossible words, walked the same dusty roads for 3 years. And in the end he sold all of it for 30 pieces of silver, the going price of a slave. He led armed soldiers to Jesus in a garden in the dark, and he marked the man with a kiss. This is not a story about a number. This is not a story about silver coins. This is not a story about a single bad decision on a single dark night. This is a story about how close you can stand to the light, for how long, and still turn and choose the dark. Judas is the warning woven right into the middle of the 12. Nearness is not the same as faith. You can walk beside the truth for 3 solid years, eat at its table, and still hand it over for the price of a slave. Let that question sit on you. Where are you actually standing, and not just where are you sitting? And his seat did not stay empty for long. The remaining 11 prayed and chose a man named Matthias to take his place, a man who had quietly been there from the very beginning, following, watching, never once named in a single story, until the moment he was suddenly needed. Let me stop you here for just a second, because we are entering the final stretch, and this is the part that matters most. If you have made it this far with me, you are not a casual viewer. So let me ask you directly. Keep a name in your mind as we go, the disciple whose story is hitting you hardest, because at the end I am going to ask you for it. Now, the last 3 men. And one of them changes everything. There was a second James, called James the Less, and a man named Thaddeus, who was also called Jude. And here is the honest truth about them. They are the disciples without the famous stories, the 2 the Gospels barely mention by name. And maybe that, in itself, is the point you most need to hear. Most of you will never have a famous story either. Most of us serve in places no camera ever finds, in small rooms, in ordinary towns, where no one writes anything down. The tradition says these 2 quiet men also carried the message into hostile foreign lands, and the tradition says they also were killed for refusing to stop. No crowds. No recorded last words. Just faithfulness, all the way to the end, with no audience at all except God. And that was enough. And then, of the 12, there was one left. John. The brother of James, the disciple the Gospel simply calls the one whom Jesus loved. He was almost certainly the youngest of them. And he was the only one of the 12 who did not run away on the night of the crucifixion. While the others scattered into the dark, terrified for their lives, John stood at the very foot of the cross. And from that cross, in his dying breath, Jesus looked down and gave his own mother into John's care. And here is the staggering thing about John's long life. He is the only one of the 12 who was not martyred. He lived. He lived through the violent deaths of all of his friends, one by one by one. Try, just for a moment, to feel that grief. Imagine being the very last man alive who had actually walked the roads of Galilee beside Jesus. The last one who could still remember the real sound of his laugh, the look on his face. And one by one, every single brother is taken from you. Peter, upside down in Rome. Andrew, tied to his cross for 2 days. James, cut down by Herod's sword. Bartholomew, flayed in Armenia. Thomas, speared on a hill in India. And you, John, still here. Still breathing. Still carrying all of it alone. The Roman authorities, the tradition says, even tried to execute John, and somehow could not. And so they did the next cruelest thing they could think of. They took an old man, the last living apostle of Jesus Christ, and they exiled him. They dropped him on a small, barren, windswept island in the middle of the Aegean Sea. A prison made of rock and salt and silence. The island was called Patmos. And there, on that black volcanic rock, exactly where I told you at the start we were going, the last disciple of Jesus, old and alone and grieving every friend he had ever buried, fell flat to the ground. Because a voice spoke behind him. The same kind of voice that had called Peter up out of the water more than 60 years before. John turned, and he saw a vision so overwhelming, so far beyond anything human, that he could only write, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though I were dead." There is a Greek word that ties this whole story together. Martes. It originally meant simply a witness, someone who testifies to what they have seen with their own eyes. But because so many of these witnesses were killed for refusing to take back their testimony, that one Greek word slowly changed its meaning forever. Martes became our word, martyr. The witnesses became the martyrs. To see what they saw, in that century, was to sign your own death warrant. And 11 of the 12 signed it gladly. What that exiled old man witnessed on Patmos became the final book of the Bible. The Revelation. The last word, given to the last man. The fisherman's friend who outlived them all, handed a glimpse of how the entire story ends. Every tear wiped from every eye. Death itself thrown down and destroyed. A new heaven and a new earth, and the voice from the throne saying, "Behold, I am making all things new." The 12 began by a quiet sea in Galilee. And the story closed on a lonely sea at Patmos. From water to water. From the very first call to the very final vision. So what on earth do you do with 12 men like this? Here is the first thing, and it is simple. These were not supermen. They were fishermen who panicked and screamed in storms. A tax collector that an entire nation despised. A political hothead. A sharp-tongued skeptic. A doubter. A betrayer. And a handful of men so completely ordinary that the Bible does not even bother to record their stories. If God chose to build his entire church on people exactly like that, then hear this clearly. He is not looking for the qualified. He never, ever was. Which means the thing you are most ashamed of is not the thing that disqualifies you. Here is the second thing, and this one is aimed straight at you. 11 of these men chose torture and execution rather than take back a single word of what they had seen. And people do not do that for a story they know is a lie. A person might live comfortably inside a lie. But almost no one on earth endures the cross, the spear, and the flaying knife to protect a rumor they made up themselves.